Hello and welcome back. This is going to be the third video in my series about creating an MVC project using Visual Studio 2019. This video we're not going to be looking at the code at all. I'm going to be just giving a bit of a presentation about some of the things that we're going to be coming up against when we're creating the databases. So I wanted you to really understand some of the terminology I'm going to be using first of all, and why we're using these methods of doing things. Again, this is just going to be an overview, so I'm not going to go completely into everything about what I'm talking about here. It's just to give you a bit of an idea, so when we come to the coding it should make things a little bit easier for you. You might have seen that I've mentioned previously something called code first. This is what we're going to be using when we're creating the databases. First of all, what is code first? To put it simply, it's a way of creating and managing databases by using code within a project to perform the actions. What are some other approaches to making databases? Well, the traditional way of creating a database would be to separate the functions of making the code and making the databases. So one team might go ahead and design a database in a certain way, and then the people in the code are designing the code, and then really they've got to collaborate to try and bring that together after both things are created. It's quite a traditional way of creating databases, and there's nothing particularly wrong with it, especially if one person is just creating a database and creating the project themselves. However, I really believe in code first, and I'll show you the reasons why. So as I said, why do we use code first? This is quite a contentious issue. Different people have different opinions on why we would use code first, but I'll outline some of the things that I believe are important to me when it comes to code first. Well, first of all, code first is very flexible and very transparent, and what I mean by that is that because you're creating the models that create the databases, it's very easy to see what sits on the database just from looking at the models. And it's also incredibly flexible that if we create it through the code, we can alter different bits of the database as we go along and as we need to, rather than then having to go back to the database in a separate application, maybe alter it from there, or if you're working with another team, having to then go and communicate to the other team that you need something changing before you can change it in the code, or your code's going to break. With the code first way, we can change anything within the program itself and see what's happening at all times. I have quite a modern way of making databases and programs that rely on databases now is, while testing it and before release, would be to create it by using a local database. And what I mean by that is something that's local to each person's system. So you're not having to go and release it on a platform like, for example, Azure. You would be able to just do that on your own computer and work with other people. The problem with that is that you have different information in your system to what you have in another person's system. So it's really important that they're called the same and such like. However, when we use code first, because we're building the databases from here, we do something which is called migrations. So the changes that we make on our system, if we do it through the code, as soon as somebody else who downloads that same code updates their system, those changes would also be applied to their database. This can also be for putting data in the database as well, which is called seeding the database. The next thing I want to talk about is that it's a very streamlined database management system. And what that really means to me is that we're not having to create additional things that then can communicate with the database. Yes, we do have to make methods for it to do this and tell it where the things are, but because we're creating the models within it, we don't have to then put additional things on the top of that to communicate with something externally. The program's very clever and knows where it is as long as we've specified it beforehand, so we reduce on a lot of the sort of bloating of the files that would normally happen if you just use it in an external way. And the last thing I want to say is that I consider it to be the best of both worlds, that you can have a very, very structurally sound database because you can specify so much within the code first. Things that you would normally do in a traditional database manner, for example, limiting the number of characters or specifying that something's optional, even to the case of using foreign keys and the relationships in between the databases. We can actually do that with code first, so making it very solid. But on the other side of it as well, the coders who are just writing the code within the program can really specify and use that to their advantage while writing the code. So it's very structurally sound for the people who are making the databases and looking after those databases, but also it's very easy for the coders to read and alter as they need to as well. So there's not this thing of constantly having to go back and, oh, what was that called in the database? How do I get into that database? Oh no, they've changed something now. We've got it all in both sides straight away. So it's really is a very good approach of working, especially when you're working with teams. The next thing I want to talk about is models within MVC. This is another important component of MVC, obviously model, views and controllers. I've left this until last. And we've so far discussed the views and the controllers. The reason being is because it can be quite a complex issue of exactly what a model is. And there's, again, different ways of looking at what the function of a model is. I'm going to define 3 different definitions of a model within the MVC pattern. These can be used in different ways, but there is a standard way of using these models. So the first thing that we have is domain models. Now this is primarily what we're going to be interested in, because we're going to be creating domain models, and the domain models are just C# classes like any other models, but they define a certain amount of properties, and from those domain models we build the database from there. And we have something called data transfer models, or some people would call it data transfer objects, or DTOs. Data transfer objects, sometimes they aren't necessary because we might be just using a domain model to do this. But if you imagine that we take a request from a user. Now within MVC, the best practice way of doing that is actually putting it into a model. Now the domain model that connects to the database might not always be relevant. It might have more on the domain model than we actually need, or for that matter less than we actually need, and the domain models are really kept in a way which is there for the database to read. So we might have different names as such, like coming in from the data transfer models. If we're using generics and using multiple tables to do different things from our database, then we might be using data transfer models to specify that a little bit better. Or it might be even the case that we're not actually putting stuff into the database from the user with a data transfer model anyway. We're just taking information from them, and that's generally used through a post method and a form on a page, which would then fill in a data transfer model and send it back to us so we can do something with it. Again, sometimes it's a case of all we need is that domain model, so we can literally just fill in that domain model from the page. But it isn't the way that we normally work with things. We normally have this middleman of the data transfer model, or sometimes just use the view model, which you'll see in the next slide. And the third one, standard model that we use within MVC, is a view model. Now what this does, it's very similar to both of them. We've got a bunch of properties on the C# class. However, we generally use those view models for specific views to tell what we want on that page. So there might be some things that wouldn't be in the domain model or wouldn't be needed to be sent back on the data transfer model, but we want to see them on the page. We want to display certain parts of information. We might be taking information, for example, from the session information and putting that into a view model. Or we might be taking a list of some other of the domain models that we've taken and viewing those separately. Or say, for example, if we had a list that we'd taken one from one domain model and one from another domain model, but we only wanted a couple of sections in there, we'd probably use a view model and make a view model from that to display on the page. So yeah, generally that's what view models are for. We can also use them as data transfer models to send information back. As best practice, it's generally quite good when dealing with more complex stuff to keep these three things quite separated, even if it means transferring from one kind of model to another kind of model. It just helps to keep things nice and clean within the code. The next thing we're going to talk about is something called CRUD design. Now, the reason I talk about all of these things right now is because when we start implementing things within Visual Studio with the MVC template, it will actually give us the opportunity to do a lot of this stuff automatically and talk about using the CRUD design. It's a very standard and very good way of working with things, especially when it comes to databases and such like. I'll go through it briefly now. So the C is for create, and as you can imagine, that's creating something new that's going to be then passed on to our database. Then there's a read, and as you can imagine, that is displaying some information that we've got from our database. Update, so updating a piece of information in our database. And destroy, and that's, as it says, destroying some information that we've taken in our database. I want to go a little bit through what we call them within inside the Visual Studio MVC template. The names do differ a little bit to just the plain CRUD, and there's reasons for that. But the ways that we use them within MVC are quite standard. At first, it's very tempting to change these around, and honestly, it doesn't make too much difference to your project if you do, as long as it still knows where to look for certain things. However, it's quite good to leave the naming convention as it is, for a couple of reasons. For one, the routing's automatically going to look for the things in this way. And secondly, if somebody else comes along to the project, or even yourself a few years later, it's very easy to follow if you understand this way that it works. That you don't have to go, oh well, what does this one do again, and oh, where was that page going to, and having to follow it all around. It's very easy to follow this way. So the create is a really simple one. Within Visual Studio, is just called create. So you would have the name of the thing you're creating, then a slash, then create. So if you remember before, the controller home, then it would be home create. Now it's probably not going to be applicable for home create at all, but you'll see this more when we create some models for tables in our database, that then each of the tables will get their own controller, and within the controller we're going to have these different routes. The create, and we'll talk a little bit about the HTTP routes. These are very standard things. There is some other ways of doing things, but the standard two routes that we're going to be using is a get and post route. In fact, these are the only two routes that the actual HTTP recognizes. In some programs we do use other things like a delete or a put. These are things that were suggested to be used within HTTP originally, but were actually never implemented. So they are very good, and they're very useful for keeping your code separated and nice and clean and such like, but mostly each framework has a way of dealing with that. For example, in .NET, there's ways around that, and it will recognize when you use it, but it'll always say, for example, a put route, but it'll always convert that back to a post route, and then just specify what it does with that for HTTP routes. So just to give you a brief overview on that, a get route is we're taking some information from the server, be it whatever that is. Generally, when we're talking about these, we're going to be, for example, a create here, we would get a form. So we would say we want to create a new entry of whatever it is we're creating. It would then send us a form, which you would find go down the get route and go and find the view for that, just like we created before with the hello route in the index. It went and got that view for us. So yeah, go and get us a view that shows us this form. Sometimes when we're making a get route, we're actually sending through a model template. Now that can be a data transfer model, as we discussed, or it could be the domain model itself, or a view model. But either way, we'll be sending something through to it to be able to get that. Then we have a post route. The post route, it literally just takes the information back in again. So we complete our create form and we hit submit on that create form, that we create something new. It gets sent to the post route, and the convention is that the post route is going to be called the same thing. So we would have a create route, a create method from the create CRUD design, and it'd be a create method for whatever it is we're creating. And that would have two things to it. It'd have a get and a post. They'd be called exactly the same, except one is a get and one is a post. So we specify that we're sending it back to that post route, and it takes the information that we've just built using a data transfer model that we sent through, and we send it back to the post route to process that. And once the post route has processed that, the general thing to do with that would be to process that information, then redirect to somewhere else. So that at that point it would redirect to another get route, maybe the root of your folder, or maybe just a step back from where you were in the first place, maybe back to exactly the same page. But the post route is going to deal with the stuff. The get route is just literally letting us display the information. Then we have the read. In the MVC template in Visual Studio, this is called index, and we also have something called details. Now the index, as we've seen before, that is just reading the information of everything that we've got on our main page. So for example, if we had something which was a student's model and a student's controller, then the index is just going to get all the instances in the database of that student, so all the information from there, and display it on the screen. Now again, we could specify that we don't want that to happen exactly when we do that for a view model, because we might have a load of information on the students. If we're an educational institution, a load of information on the students, and we don't really want to see all of that displayed straight away. We might just want to see a name and an age or a student enrollment number. So we can specify that by using a view model, and that view model would take the information from the database and display the bits that we want to see. Then we have a details. This is a little bit different in the fact that with index we're viewing a whole load of things. So we're saying we want everything from that table as specified in the view model, and display the whole lot of the information, whatever information we want. Now with the details, that is talking about having a particular thing, a specific thing. So we might, for example, click on something in the index, and then we see the details of that specific thing. Generally we would again use this to display one item, but we'd also want to see more details of it. So for example, if I was creating a database of books, then I might say I want all the books displayed on the index page, and it would just give me a whole list of the names of the books, maybe the author as well, but a whole list of them. And then if I go, oh, I want to know more about that individual book, I could click on details, and it might then go and get the description that we've put in from the database as well, and put that with it for that specific book. So we're just going into smaller layers, really, that the details is taking an ID as well. Now with the read route, as you can imagine, it's just a read-only thing, so we're just wanting to get things. We're not wanting to do anything with the information in the read, we're just wanting to be able to look at it. This is the majority of how most programs, web apps, actually work. That the update, destroy and create are really very separate, And most of what you're doing is looking at information. So for example, Wikipedia and such like, the majority of what you do when you go on there is use these read routes in whichever way they do it. And that's just a get request on this. Okay, well, I see something more specific in the Wikipedia entry, so I'm going to click on that, and it goes to details for that and gives me some more specific things, and using the views and the details. Obviously you can then go and create an update within Wikipedia as well, but the main thing that you're looking at there is the read. So I'd say that this is probably used more than anything else, especially when we've already got information within the database. Next we'll look at the update. In MVC, in Visual Studio, it's just called edit. So what we're going to be doing with that though is there isn't a general thing, because we don't want to edit everything. That wouldn't work for us. There is specific cases where that could work for us, and again we'd be doing that through using view models and data transfer models that we're saying we want to edit this group, or however we want to do it. But generally what we're looking for then, like the details, is an ID of the thing that we want to edit. And that again has a get and a post method that we click on the edit function for a particular model, and it will get us the information relating to the ID of that particular entry that's in the database, that's defined by the model. Then once we've finished editing it, we send it through to a post route, where it then communicates with the database, checks that everything's in order. Generally how these things work is that it'll check that everything's right. If it's not right, it will then redirect you back to a get route and send the information back to you, quite often with a message saying that there's something wrong here. Imagine a login page that if your email or your password isn't correct, it will generally send something back to you saying email and password do not match, or whatever it is that they use. And that's because it's been sent through to the post method. The post method's checked it, said that's not right, and sends you back to the get method. But within the edit, if everything is right, if it accepts the data that you've given, you haven't left any blank fields. Again, we can use blank fields if we wish. We specify that, and using the code first approach, we can actually say this is a required thing that we need, or it isn't required. We'll get onto that a little bit when we start doing the code first exercises. So we send it through to the post, it updates that, communicates with the database, then redirects us to something else, generally one of these. For most of the cases, for an edit, it will send us back through to the details for the item that we've just edited. So now we can see on the screen, okay, this is what we've just edited. Which takes me down to the last one, which is the destroy. Within the MVC template in Visual Studio, it's simply called delete. And the delete function, as you can imagine, it deletes a certain thing. So again, it's going to take an ID so we know what it is exactly we want to delete. It would be a very unsafe thing to be able to just delete a whole table at once. So we generally do it for individual items. Again, there can be massive differences in if you need that functionality within your program, but as a general thing, we're going to take an individual item and we're going to delete it. And again, that's going to have the get and the post, just like the edit. It's going to get the request for that, give us a view to delete it, even if that is just simply are you sure you want to delete this thing, and show us the details of it. You can do that without a get route, and I know some people do, where you just literally click on it and it deletes it straight away. That, for most cases, is quite an unsafe way of doing things. However, there's some cases where that's perfectly acceptable. It really depends on what you're working on, but for the standard convention, we're going to use a get route to delete something, to just display a form that says, are you sure you want to delete this item? And if we say yes, it sends that post request through. It will update the database to remove that item or destroy the item from the database. and then it will redirect us. In this case, it won't redirect us to the ID of the thing that we've just destroyed because it no longer exists. So in most cases, it's going to then redirect us to this index to show us all of the items that are left. So for example, using this book example, if you had a whole list of books and one book had gone missing, you might say, well, I'm going to delete that book, or something got damaged or whatever. So you go into it, you find the item that you want to delete, you delete that, it gives you a get route to say, are you sure you want to delete this book? You say, yes, I do. It sends that request through to the post, updates the database, then takes us back to the whole list of books again. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I know I've covered quite a lot in this video, and you certainly don't have to remember everything here. It's really useful to sort of get your head around a few of these issues, especially the basic concepts of code first and CRUD design, because we will be using them in the videos coming up. But I did want to just give you a bit of an overview. Again, with the things with the models, it can be quite complicated in exactly how they are used. There is no one perfect way of using the models and only one way you can use those. There's various different disagreements on that. I'm trying to follow the way which is recommended by Microsoft and the .NET framework because that's what we're working within with this. However, you'll see plenty of other frameworks that do things in very different types of ways. Anyway, I shall wrap up now. I hope this has been some use to you. Again, if you like the video, please like, subscribe, tell other people about it, whatever you normally do with videos, and I shall see you next time.